History is filled with stories of conquest and colonization, some driven by power and wealth, others by faith and ideals. In recent years, many have begun to label history's victors as unjust colonizers, particularly in the West. But how accurate is this view? Were all conquests the same? Today, we'll explore the key differences between Christian colonization and the rule of the Aztec Empire. How did their motivations and methods differ, and what does that tell us about history? Stay with us to find out. Throughout history, every nation, tribe, and civilization has been shaped by the movement of people. Borders were never permanent. They shifted as populations expanded, conquered, and settled new lands. This was the natural course of human history. One group displacing another, building new societies and leaving their mark on the world. Every society, from ancient empires to small tribal communities, was established through conquest and colonization in some form. No nation simply appeared out of nowhere. Today, some activists advocate for returning lands to their original inhabitants, but history is rarely that simple. If you rewind time far enough, you'll find that most groups took their land from others who came before them. The Aztecs, for example, were themselves conquerors who expanded their empire by subjugating neighboring tribes. Yet, compared to the European colonizers who arrived in the 16th century, were the Aztecs more advanced? In terms of architecture and agricultural innovation, they were certainly impressive. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was a stunning city built on a vast lake with sophisticated canals and aqueducts. But their brutal practices, such as large-scale human sacrifice, set them apart from the Europeans. Could the Aztecs have spread their influence beyond Central America if history had unfolded differently? It's a fascinating question. History teaches us that power and conquest are rarely predictable, and even the most powerful empires eventually face their limits. In 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the American government had illegally taken the Black Hills from the Lakota Sioux, violating an earlier treaty. The court acknowledged the injustice and ordered financial compensation, hundreds of millions of dollars, including interest. But the land was not returned. Even today, the Lakota refuse to accept the money, insisting that the Black Hills are sacred and should be restored to them. Yet returning the land raises complicated questions. For instance, over 250,000 Americans now live there. Removing them would create an entirely new set of problems. The deeper challenge lies in the history of the Black Hills. The Sioux only held the land for a short time. In the late 18th century, they took it from the Cheyenne, who had previously taken it from the Kiowa and Crow. Before them, the Comanche and Arapaho controlled the region. If we were to reverse history, who would be the rightful owner? Each tribe conquered another to claim the land. Decolonization sounds simple in theory, but it becomes complex when traced back through generations. How far back do we go? Is it even possible to fully undo the past? History is rarely clean or fair. Every conquest leaves layers of stories, victories, and losses that can never be fully untangled. For most of history, the right of conquest was an accepted reality. If a nation could seize land and hold on to it long enough, it was considered theirs. Borders shifted constantly as empires rose and fell, and no one questioned the legitimacy of those who emerged victorious. This was simply how the world worked. It wasn't until recent decades that some began rejecting this historical norm. Liberal movements sought to outlaw conquest altogether, believing human nature could be changed. But history proves otherwise. People have always expanded, explored, and taken new lands. No decree or policy has ever erased this instinct. In comparing civilizations, it's clear that the experience of being conquered could vary dramatically. Under the Aztecs, life could be brutal for those they subjugated. Conquered tribes were forced to pay heavy tribute and often lived in fear of being chosen for human sacrifice. In contrast, Christian colonizers, while far from perfect, brought different ideals, including the concept of personal freedom grounded in biblical morality. Over time, Christian influence introduced new systems of law and governance that expanded individual rights. Daily life under the Aztecs was rigid and deeply tied to their religious practices, while Christian colonization introduced European customs, education, and trade. The question remains, if given the choice, which rule would offer a more stable and freer life? Throughout history, the primary motivation for colonization was often material gain, conquering new lands to access resources, wealth, and power. Empires were built on the spoils of war and the exploitation of conquered territories. But Western colonization, particularly in the age of exploration, wasn't driven solely by greed. Many colonizers pursued higher ideals, including the desire to spread Christianity and reshape the moral foundations of the societies they encountered. This added a complex layer to their actions, blending spiritual mission with political and economic ambitions. For Christian colonizers, the justification for conquest was rooted in their belief that they were bringing truth and salvation to others. To them, spreading Christianity was not only a moral duty, but an act of mercy. They saw the indigenous practices, especially violent rituals like human sacrifice, as something that needed to be eradicated. While this sense of mission often led to genuine efforts to improve lives, it also led to the suppression of local cultures and traditions. The long-term impacts of Christian colonization are still felt today. It brought education, new governance systems, and Western technology, but it also caused deep cultural disruption. The legacy is complicated, filled with both progress and loss, leaving historians and descendants alike to question whether the spiritual and moral changes justified the means used to achieve them. Not all colonization was driven by greed and conquest. Some Western colonizers made immense personal sacrifices in pursuit of higher ideals. The Pilgrims of the Mayflower left behind lives of relative comfort in search of religious freedom. Their journey to the New World was dangerous and uncertain, and nearly half of them died during the first harsh winter in America. They weren't seeking riches, they were striving for a place to live out their faith without persecution. Even in the political realm, figures like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson paid a high price for their service. Washington, who could have remained a wealthy plantation owner, sacrificed much of his personal wealth and well-being during the Revolutionary War to lead the fight for independence. Jefferson, known for penning the Declaration of Independence, died in debt after devoting much of his life to public service. These stories paint a more complex picture of Western colonization, revealing that it wasn't always about personal gain. Altruistic motives, such as the desire to promote religious freedom, spread education, and create just societies, often coexisted with harsher realities. Understanding these sacrifices forces us to reconsider the broad label of colonizer, and recognize that some of these individuals truly believed they were building something better, even at great personal cost. The Aztec and Christian colonizations were vastly different in their approaches and impacts. The Aztec Empire rose to power through military conquest, bringing many neighboring tribes under its control. They demanded heavy tribute from their subjects, often taking captives for human sacrifice. In one infamous ritual, tens of thousands of victims were sacrificed over just 4 days. The priests would cut open their chests, remove their still-beating hearts as offerings to their gods, and toss the lifeless bodies down the temple steps. For the tribes under Aztec rule, life was marked by fear and the constant threat of becoming the next sacrifice. When Hernan Cortes arrived in 1521, he witnessed these brutal practices firsthand. His conquest of the Aztecs put an end to the human sacrifices and introduced Christianity to the region. For many, this was seen as a positive development, a shift from terror and bloodshed to a new moral framework based on Christian teachings. However, Christian colonization was not without its own harshness. While it stopped human sacrifice and brought new systems of governance and education, it also suppressed native cultures and imposed European customs. So which rule was more brutal, Aztec or Christian? The answer depends on perspective, but one thing is clear. Life under the Aztecs was far more dangerous for the conquered peoples, especially those chosen as sacrifices to satisfy the gods. Not all colonization is equal. Some were far more brutal than others. So here's the final question. Who would you rather be colonized by? Christians or Aztecs? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more thought-provoking content.